Between 1799 and 1815, Europe became hell. Kingdoms collapsed, millions died, and the entire continent fell under the shadow of one man. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He began as a general, but soon became the Emperor of Europe. His armies could not be stopped until the frozen winter of Russia. And in the end, the man who shook the world fell at Waterloo. Europe was burning, and from the chaos, one man rose, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not just a general, he would change Europe forever. His armies could not be stopped, kingdoms collapsed, Europe fell into war. But every empire has an end, and Napoleon's end would come at Waterloo. Napoleon was born in Corsica in 1769. He was noble, but not rich. At a young age, he was sent to military schools in France. He excelled in artillery science. When the French Revolution began, an opportunity appeared for Napoleon, and he quickly began to rise. His victories in Italy caught Europe's attention. Now everyone knew his name. In 1798, Napoleon turned toward Egypt. His target was Britain's trade route. Near the pyramids, a great battle began. The French army crushed the Mamluks. But soon after, the British Navy attacked. The French fleet was destroyed at Abu. Napoleon left his army behind and secretly returned to France because a greater goal was waiting for him. France was in chaos. The people were exhausted. The government was collapsing. In 1799, Napoleon made his move and seized power through a coup. Now he was the first consul of France, but in reality, he was the nation's sole ruler. Napoleon's rise had begun, and Europe would soon change forever. By 1804, Napoleon wanted more, to become the sole ruler of France. A grand ceremony was held in Paris, and Napoleon placed the crown upon his own head. Europe's kings were shocked because France now had a new emperor. Napoleon was no longer just a general, he had become the most powerful man in Europe. Napoleon's rise terrified Europe, and a great war began. In 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz began. Napoleon had trapped his enemies. In 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz began. Napoleon had trapped his enemies. Austerlitz became Napoleon's greatest victory. Now he ruled Europe. After Austerlitz, Napoleon did not stop. Much of Europe fell under French control. French armies marched into Europe's cities. Kingdoms collapsed one by one. Napoleon even placed his own family on thrones. Europe now lived beneath his shadow. But one power still resisted. Britain had not surrendered. Napoleon could not defeat Britain at sea. The French navies suffered heavy losses. So instead, he created a new plan, the Continental Blockade. Europe received the order. Trade with Britain was forbidden, but the economy began to collapse. And eventually, a major crisis with Russia began. That crisis would become a disaster. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, but the people did not surrender. Guerrilla warfare began. The French army was attacked everywhere. Britain joined the war as well. Napoleon's armies were slowly being exhausted. And at that moment, a new crisis was rising in the east. Russia was the coming storm. In 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia. With him came hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But the Russians kept retreating. They burned cities and left no supplies behind. Napoleon finally reached Moscow, but the city was empty, and soon after, it was consumed by flames. When winter arrived, disaster followed. The cold destroyed Napoleon's army. After the Russian disaster, Europe united once again and declared war on Napoleon. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain gathered on the same side. In 1813, the Battle of Leipzig began. For the first time, Napoleon was truly stopped. Now he was retreating, and his empire had begun to collapse. In 1815, Napoleon escaped exile and returned to France. The soldiers joined him once again. Napoleon was back in power. But the final battle was near. At Waterloo, Napoleon suffered a crushing defeat. Napoleon was sent into exile, and years later, he died alone in the Atlantic. Napoleon died, but his influence continued across Europe. His battle tactics were studied in military academies for years. The Napoleonic Wars accelerated the birth of modern Europe. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a genius. But one truth remained: Napoleon changed the world.